Hot Wheels. The two words slipped from Jasmine Crockett's lips in the midst of a Dallas fundraiser, freezing the elegant atmosphere in an instant. It was no half-hearted jest, but a direct assault aimed at Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, seated calmly in his wheelchair. Jasmine, her face brimming with ambition, saw Abbott as a conservative icon ripe for toppling. Abbott, with his icy gaze, chose silence as a shield to mask his simmering anger. The banquet morphed into a covert battlefield. On one side, a young congresswoman eager to prove her power through mockery. On the other, a seasoned politician ready to wield restraint and experience as his counterstrike. In that room, all eyes waited. Would Abbott ignore the insult, or turn the taunt into a springboard to crush Jasmine? Beneath the warm golden glow of the Dallas fundraiser, the clink of wine glasses and the hum of laughter wove a seemingly harmless prelude. But no one in that room was naive enough to believe this was mere revelry. Every greeting, every handshake carried the weight of an unspoken contract, a pledge of money power or political advantage. And in that deceptively serene atmosphere, the spark of conflict began to flicker. Jasmine Crockett entered with a razor-sharp smile. She made no effort to conceal her ambition. Her eyes scanned the crowd cold and calculating, as if appraising each rival. To many, she was just a vibrant young congresswoman full of zeal. But those seasoned enough sensed the truth: she hadn't come to blend in, but to challenge. Her face bore no trace of deference, only the pride of someone hungry for power, determined to turn politics into a duel to prove herself. Across the room, Greg Abbott sat steady in his familiar wheelchair. A conservative politician, calm and resolute, he greeted donors with a demeanor honed over years, speaking just enough, smiling just enough, exuding assurance with every nod. For Abbott, this wasn't a stage for debate or showmanship. It was an opportunity to reinforce his image as a governor who governs, restrains, and provides stability for those who trust in him. To Jasmine, Abbott was a relic. In her eyes, he wasn't a man, but the embodiment of an outdated conservative system. Abbott had signed too many laws she deemed stains on Texas, restricting abortion rights, championing extreme gun protections, and opposing immigration reform. To her, he wasn't just a political adversary, he was an obstacle to be toppled. And Jasmine believed that to stand out to prove herself as the new face of the Democratic Party, the shortest path was to attack Abbott publicly. The banquet continued, but for Jasmine, it was a tedious warm-up. The polite speeches about budgets, the vague promises of Texas's future, held no interest for her. She hadn't come to listen. She had come to make waves. And those waves had to be seismic enough for the media to chant her name the next day. Abbott, seemingly unperturbed, ignored the challenging glares from across the room. He was no stranger to this kind of youthful ambition. Throughout his career, he'd faced countless others eager to use him as a stepping stone. But Abbott never rushed to respond. He knew the game the first to strike often reveals their weakness first. And he was content to sit, observe, and wait. The room's rhythm began to falter. A few astute guests noticed the subtle standoff between the two figures. They whispered to each other, their eyes darting from Jasmine to Abbott. Politics, as they all knew, often erupted in the unlikeliest places, not in the clamor of a legislature, but at an elegant banquet, where a single word could shift public opinion. Jasmine sipped her wine, the candlelight illuminating her resolute face. In her mind, a single thought echoed tonight. No one will remember empty promises. They'll remember me, the one who made Abbott bow. Her ambition blazed, and she knew her moment to act was near. Abbott maintained his steady cadence like a seasoned chess player. He didn't linger on Jasmine, but each fleeting glance carried a message. I'm ready. I won't dodge, but I'll let you move first. His calm made him seem like a judge, awaiting the young prosecutor's inevitable misstep. A few guests began to sense the rising tension. Laughter dwindled, and the atmosphere shifted from lively to cautious. No one said it aloud, but all knew something was about to ignite. Jasmine remained undaunted. Her sharp smile persisted, her eyes locked on Abbott. She had decided tonight would be a turning point. She wouldn't let Abbott sit there like an untouchable statue of power. She would make him a target. Abbott, with his trademark calm, gently raised his glass. The small gesture carried a message: I am unshaken. His silence was his weapon. It forced Jasmine to grow impatient to strike first, and in the political arena, the first to swing often left themselves vulnerable. The guests grew quieter, their gazes more expectant. The banquet was no longer a banquet. It had become an invisible courtroom with a jury seated around the table. There, Jasmine was the brash prosecutor Abbott, the seasoned defendant, and the room the audience was ready to render judgment. In that moment, Dallas was no longer a city of lights and music. It became a political battlefield where a single word could spark a storm. And all knew that spark was about to ignite right at this table. The lively hum of the banquet halted as Jasmine Crockett rose abruptly. The festivities' buzz faded into a distant echo. Eyes turned to her, anticipating her words, and Jasmine knew she had the stage. This was the moment she craved, a declaration that could shake the public, thrusting her into the political spotlight. She raised her glass, took a deep breath, and spoke with deliberate force: "Hot Wheels." The two words landed like a hammer, freezing the room. A few nervous chuckles broke out, only to choke off quickly. A thick silence followed, as if everyone had witnessed an irreversible collision. They understood this wasn't just a joke. It was a direct mockery of Greg Abbott's disability. The Texas governor seated silently at the table's head. Abbott looked up, his eyes quiet but piercing. He didn't frown or retort immediately. A faint smile lingered on his lips, a mask-like veil. But his hand on the wheelchair's armrest tightened slightly, the only sign of his inner turmoil. His silence, far from diminishing his presence, drew the room's focus to his every movement, every breath. Jasmine smirked, believing she'd scored a point. In her mind, victory bells rang. She had shattered the facade of calm, turning Abbott into a laughingstock before Texas's most powerful. She was certain the public would hail her as the bold truth-teller who unmasked a conservative icon. She pressed on, her voice rising sharper. Texas deserves a leader who doesn't just sit on wheels signing heartless policies. We need someone who dares to act, who dares to stand. Her words echoed, but instead of applause, there was only silence and subtle frowns. A few businessmen set down their glasses, their expressions cooling. Veteran senators shook their heads, avoiding her gaze. Their muted reactions shifted Jasmine from the one controlling the room to a lone figure on trial. Abbott said nothing. He lifted his glass, sipped, and set it down deliberately. The act wasn't random. It was a silent message: I hear you, I note you, and I'll respond when the time comes. His calm made Jasmine restless, urging her to prove she held the reins. She doubled down. Under Abbott, Texas is a mess. And yet some still trust a Hot Wheels governor to steer this state downhill. The room froze again. No more chuckles, no whispers. A businesswoman stared at Jasmine, lips pursed, her eyes a mix of disappointment and anger. A conservative senator cleared his throat, signaling a line had been crossed. Jasmine stood tall, her smile defiant, but a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. She sensed the room turning against her, yet her pride refused retreat. She believed pushing harder would cement her power. But in that moment, her image in the eyes of the powerful warped no longer a bold reformer, but a reckless aggressor, heedless of decorum. Abbott met her gaze, his eyes gleaming with unveiled contempt. He didn't need to argue. His silence let her expose her own impulsiveness. It was the gaze of a judge in a courtroom, calm, but cold, waiting for the prosecutor to falter. A longtime donor whispered nearby, "She just ended her career." Another nodded. "Abbott hasn't spoken, and she's already lost." The words, soft but swift, rippled through the room. The banquet now resembled a courtroom. Jasmine stood as the accused, her words turning into evidence against her. Abbott sat still, needing no defense, for his silence had become an indictment of his opponent. The guests sat tense, none daring to break the silence. Some reporters scribbled quietly, their eyes alight. knowing they held explosive news. But even they saw this wasn't a deft political strike. It was a double-edged sword that could cost Jasmine everything. The room grew stifling. Steaks cooled wine glasses sat untouched. All focus was on the showdown. No one cared about prepared speeches, fundraising goals, or distant political plans. Everything was drowned by two words: Hot Wheels. Jasmine clung to her confident facade, but inside she wavered. Part of her believed she'd triumphed. Another sensed she'd ignited a firestorm. But there was no turning back. She'd gone too far left only to hope the public would rally behind her. Abbott remained silent, but his unblinking, icy stare turned his quiet into the heaviest accusation. The room understood he didn't need to shout or rush. He only needed to wait for the moment to strike, and when he did, Jasmine's words would turn back to crush her. In politics, sometimes no gavel or lawyer is needed. A single misspoken word, a moment past the line, can turn a lavish banquet into a trial, the attacker into the judged. And tonight, Jasmine had made herself the center of that trial. Abbott sat motionless, but his stillness was power. He wasn't the loser. He was the one waiting for his opponent to fall into her own trap. The room held its breath, knowing the real battle hadn't begun, but the first to lose ground was clear. The air after Jasmine's Hot Wheels jab was sliced clean by an invisible blade. The initial awkward laughs died, leaving a thick, lingering silence. At the table's head, Greg Abbott said nothing, showed no reaction, made no haste to grimace or rebut. He simply sat, his hands gripping the wheelchair's arms, the veins in his hands faintly visible. In that moment, his silence weighed like lead pressing on everyone present, forcing backs to straighten, eyes to dart waiting. Abbott knew an outburst of anger would only cast him as the defender an easy target for Jasmine's next thrust. Decades in politics had taught him silence wasn't surrender, it was a weapon. And now, he wielded it like an invisible indictment, turning Jasmine into a solo performer in a courtroom drama. Jasmine didn't grasp this. Seeing Abbott still, she mistook it for fear, for faltering under her attack. Her arrogance flared. Raising her voice, she piled on sharp barbs. This is an era of innovation, not stale conservatism. Texans are tired of prolonged policy failures. Her words hammered down, but each sentence, instead of rousing excitement, cut deeper into the guests' patience. Reactions emerged, a frown here, a glass set down hard, their faces cooling. Jasmine's voice rang out, but it didn't inspire political leadership. It sounded like the shout of someone desperate for attention. Abbott remained silent, gently swirling his wine. The small motion under the candlelight signaled he still held control. His eyes stayed on Jasmine, steady and cold, as if dissecting her every word for a final reckoning. His silence wasn't evasion. It was an invisible wall daring her to charge again. The guests sensed the shift. At first, some were curious, thinking Jasmine might surprise. But as she continued, her impatience showed. Her voice grew shrill, her words less reasoned, more personal venom. A donor whispered, "She's not attacking policy anymore, she's just bitter." Another nodded. Abbott hasn't spoken, and she shot herself in the foot. But Jasmine didn't see. Her excitement surged. She believed the audience was rapt, ready to cheer. So she launched into a litany, accusing Abbott of turning Texas into a healthcare circus, of shirking responsibility, for women and children, of being a king on wheels ruling with inertia and apathy. Each word aimed to crush Abbott at the table. But it backfired. The air grew suffocating. Jasmine's venom became a burden. No longer a champion, she appeared a reckless aggressor, unable to control herself. Reporters scribbled quietly. She was torching her own image. Abbott kept swirling his glass, still silent, but his quiet now held the upper hand. He didn't need to refute her. Jasmine was refuting herself. Her tone exposed her error. His calm began to sway the audience. In their eyes, Abbott was no longer the accused, but a resilient victim enduring an unbridled attack. Jasmine noticed the disapproving glances, but dismissed them as cowardice, believing they lacked the courage to agree openly. She thought she needed to push harder, fiercer. So she continued. Each time Abbott didn't respond, she saw it as proof of his weakness. She didn't realize his silence was the noose tightening around her career. In a moment, the room became an unspoken courtroom. Jasmine was the frantic prosecutor, Abbott the steady defendant, and the guests the jury. And that jury, with its silence, was leaning toward Abbott. A few whispered nearby, "He'll respond, just not yet." Exactly, he's letting her self-destruct. The soft words spread a quiet current in the room. Abbott's gaze held Jasmine unwavering, as if saying, "I've heard it all, and when I speak, you'll have no escape." To those present, the banquet was no longer a glamorous fundraiser. It was a trial where one spoke too much, the other not at all, yet still held sway. And all waited Abbott's counterstrike was coming, and it would be heavy enough to end the cruel farce before them. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was a preemptive blow, a steel wall. And as Jasmine charged on, the outcome was clear. One voice faltered, the other grew stronger in silence. Abbott's grip tightened once more, then relaxed. He was ready. The room, taut as a bowstring, leaned toward him, waiting for his words. The taut silence stretched long enough to submerge the room in a heavy atmosphere. Jasmine's tirade persisted, but her words now rang out like shrill echoes in a saturated void. Then the moment everyone awaited arrived. Greg Abbott set his glass down, the crisp sound of glass striking wood cutting through, commanding every head to turn. He spoke, his voice steady, and clear, each word a hammer, silencing stray whispers. "I understand what's being implied." He began without raising his tone, yet the authority in his words stilled the room. "Years ago, an accident changed my life. I lost the ability to walk, but I never lost the ability to lead." The simple, piercing words made Jasmine falter. The mocking smile lingering on her lips turned stiff. Abbott paused, his gaze softening briefly, as if old memories were resurfacing. He didn't shy away from them, but let them take center stage in the opulent room. "Years ago," he said slowly, "a morning that seemed ordinary changed everything. I left home as I did every day, carrying the belief I could control my world. But in an instant, a sudden gust, a falling branch, my life would never be the same." The room seemed to shrink. Guests, breathless from the verbal sparring, fell silent, drawn into his every word. I remember the sound of metal crashing, my body pinned to the ground, and the creeping numbness spreading from my legs through my frame. In that moment, I thought, this is it. My life ends here. Abbott paused, his voice dropping low. Those first months. I sat in a hospital room, staring out the window at people walking freely, my heart torn apart. I was desperate, ready to give up. There were times I wondered, how can someone bound to wheel still dream, still lead? Jasmine swallowed hard, the mocking smile on her face cracking into awkwardness. But then Abbott's voice rose. I realized strength isn't in the legs. It's in rising from the abyss. I chose not to let tragedy consume me. I chose to make it my drive. I threw myself into learning, working, serving to prove some paths don't need feet, only will. He recounted the long nights, mastering his wheelchair, navigating rooms alone, the sweat on his hands as he reached for a door. Each small victory brought me back to life. I learned that if I could face the impossible in myself, I could lead others through greater adversities. Then, deftly, Abbott shifted from personal story to political argument. He listed Texas's achievements under his tenure programs, supporting jobs for the disabled, budgets for accessible infrastructure, and reforms integrating hundreds of thousands into society. He didn't lecture. He delivered facts, numbers, and concrete examples. Under the flickering candles, his voice wasn't just a story. It was a legal brief, precise and irrefutable. Jasmine sat frozen, her eyes restless. She was accustomed to dominating with barbs, but now Abbott's words stripped her confidence, each sentence a slow blade. Guests who'd bristled at her venom nodded, their faces shifting from curiosity to admiration. Abbott paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I sit in this wheelchair, he said, but it hasn't stopped me from leading Texas through crises. When the pandemic hit, I was there. When storm struck, I was there. When we reformed social support, I was there. I don't walk with my feet, but I move with will and duty to the people." The room was silent. Silverware had long stilled. Abbott was no longer a target, but a leader standing tall, if only in words defending his personal and political honor. He didn't need to attack Jasmine. His transformation of weakness into strength was the strongest rebuttal. In that moment, Jasmine seemed diminished. Eyes once fixed on her turned away. She felt her control slip, her unease visible. Her hand trembled as she set down her glass, and to many her confidence was a crumbling facade. Abbott pressed on, his voice steady, as stone people can mock this wheelchair. "But it's carried me to the greatest responsibility of my life, and I'll never let it be a reason to falter." An invisible shift rippled through the room. Guests who'd sat silent now nodded some clasping hands as if hearing a vow. The tense, heavy air turned to quiet consensus, a clear tilt toward Abbott. Jasmine opened her mouth to interrupt, but no one looked her way. Abbott's words had claimed the space, rendering any rebuttal futile. And the bitter truth, she was no longer the center, but a shadow reflecting failure in her moment of supposed triumph. As Abbott fell silent, the quiet wasn't tense. It was respect. The echo of a brief but piercing speech that turned the tide in minutes. He was no longer just a conservative governor, but a symbol of resilience, proof that politics wasn't just power. It was turning weakness into a weapon. The air in the room was so thick that the clink of a spoon against a glass rang like metal striking metal. Everyone sensed the invisible currents of history taking shape before their eyes. Abbott had shared his life story, turning the tide, with his calm resolve, but all knew this was merely the prelude. He held something back, a final precise blade to end the confrontation. Jasmine Crockett sat just steps away, but the distance felt like a chasm. She forced a smile, her lips trembling, her eyes wavering, betraying her unease. In her mind, fragmented thoughts collided. I've gone too far, but stopping now would show weakness. I must hold my ground at all costs. Pride kept her back straight, but anxiety etched itself into her gaze, caught by the keen eyes of reporters recording every moment. Abbott leaned forward. The small motion was a clarion call. The room fell utterly silent. Those who had been exasperated, shaking their heads in disdain, now looked up expectant. Donors and senators ceased their whispers. Even some reporters forgot to snap photos. All knew this was the decisive moment. Abbott's eyes locked onto Jasmine. They held no raw anger, only the cold certainty of a long-prepared verdict. Then his voice rang out steady and resolute, each word falling like a hammer crushing the last remnants of resistance. "This wheelchair doesn't limit my path. It only limits the vision of those who look down. A single lethal strike enough to end it all." The frozen room fell into absolute silence. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, letting each word seep into their veins. No evidence was needed, no defense required. It was an indictment, a proclamation of victory distilled into one sentence. Jasmine choked. Her throat tightened, her hands trembling beneath the table. She tried to open her mouth to retort, but no words came. Her forced smile twisted into a grimace. In the eyes of the onlookers, the confidence that once made her shine was now a tattered mask. Then applause erupted. One clap from the farthest corner, then two, then three. Within seconds, the room exploded in a wave of thunderous applause. It wasn't mere approval, it was a verdict, a public judgment declaring Abbott's triumph. A businessman leaned close to his neighbor, whispering, "That line will make history." A conservative senator nodded, a satisfied smirk curling his lips. Reporters along the walls scribbled, furiously certain that by morning every major outlet would lead with that sentence. Abbott sat still, saying no more. He understood the art of politics. Once the killer line was delivered, the silence that followed was its seal. He needed no lengthy arguments. He let the applause, the reverent gazes around him do the rest. Jasmine was different. She lifted her glass, attempting a sip, to regain composure, but her trembling hand spilled wine over the rim drops, falling like blood, accusing her of disarray. To those watching, she was no longer a challenger of power, but a faltering figure, a loser exposed. From a corner, a young reporter thought, this moment didn't just topple a politician, it forged a legend. And indeed, the room's atmosphere had transformed entirely. Moments ago, some had wavered unsure. Now all leaned decisively toward Abbott. The fundraiser had lost its original purpose. It became a political drama, where one figure was felled on her own stage, while another ascended to glory with a single sentence. Jasmine knew she'd lost, not to political logic, but to a sharper weapon, words honed by experience and resilience. The bitterest truth was that her defeat didn't come out there in the media or legislature, but at this elegant banquet, where she'd believed the stage was hers. As the final applause faded, silence returned. But it was no longer tense. It was a silence of recognition, of consensus. Abbott didn't need to rise yet. In everyone's eyes, he towered over his rival. And Jasmine, still seated, her averted gaze cast her to the sidelines, right in the moment she'd thought would be her triumph. Hours after the banquet ended, as Dallas glowed under nighttime lights, a storm erupted online. A short video under a minute, secretly recorded by a guest, spread like wildfire. It captured Jasmine Crockett, rising mocking Abbott, as Hot Wheels followed by Abbott's calm silence absorbing it all. But the climax was his lean forward delivering the cold, concise line. This wheelchair doesn't limit my path. It only limits the vision of those who look down. On social media, the line became a rallying cry. Millions shared it overnight. Images of Abbott in that moment were turned into memes, not to mock, but to celebrate. Captions read, "Resilience is true strength. Vision, not feet, defines leadership." The hashtag #WhyDoJosh not looking down swept Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, becoming an unprecedented trend. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name exploded, but in reverse. No longer the fiery young congresswoman, she was dubbed the politician of hate. Angry comments flooded her posts. "We elect representatives, not bullies mocking disabilities," one user wrote, garnering tens of thousands of likes. "This isn't politics, it's cruelty," another added. Major media pounced. The Washington Post headlined, "One Line, One Career. Jasmine Crockett's Political Plummet." The New York Times analyzed Abbott turns. Personal attack into inspiration, a lesson for politicians in the social media age. Fox News seized the chance, dedicating airtime to claim this was proof the Democrats destroy themselves with hate and sarcasm over policy. Even the typically reserved CNN admitted a career-defining moment, and Jasmine Crockett placed herself on the wrong side of history. In Austin, Abbott's office issued a brief statement. "We believe politics should be about solutions, not insults. Texans deserve a leader who puts dignity above attacks." The succinct message reinforced his calm, resolute image from the banquet. Jasmine's office scrambled. They claimed Hot Wheels wasn't about Abbott's disability, but a political metaphor. But evidence piled up old ex-posts, where she used rolling to jab at Abbott comments she'd liked mocking him. Each detail was unearthed, a damning dossier laid bare. Morning talk shows buzzed with debate. Some argued Jasmine could recover with a sincere apology and image shift. Most were grim. In the age of instant media, one moment defines a career. This was Crockett's defining failure. Worse for Jasmine was the ripple effect. Donors wary of reputation began pulling back. A major corporation halted campaign support. Some Democratic allies went silent, avoiding her on air. A few hinted that her congressional seat could burden the party in the next election. On the streets of Dallas, Austin, and Houston, graffiti of Abbott's quote appeared not from official campaigns, but from citizens. One depicted a wheelchair with the words, "Not limited. Only stronger." It showed his line had transcended the banquet, becoming a social message. Jasmine appeared on TV, weary, trying to justify herself. But the more she spoke, the deeper she sank under criticism. The public didn't want explanations. They had a stark contrast: Abbott's calm, reasoned counter versus Jasmine's venomous bid for attention. The public's verdict was brutally simple. One was a symbol of resilience, the other of hatred. Veteran political writers called it the Dallas turning point. It wasn't just a spat, but proof that in the instant media era, one well-placed line could elevate a career to icon status, while one misstep could bury it. Jasmine Crockett lost years of image building in minutes. For Abbott, one evening solidified him not just as a conservative governor, but as an inspiring figure transcending limits. The lingering aftermath, harsh, yet fair Banquet one line, was enough to shift the political scales, drawing a clear line between a leader's composure and a power-hungry upstart's recklessness. And all who were there knew they'd witnessed a political moment to be recounted for years.